If you saw me today sitting on a sidewalk in torn clothes begging for money, you might think I was just a crazy old man. But the truth is, the madness in my eyes came from a pain that never left me. My name is Walter Hayes, and I am 70 years old. 40 years ago, my entire world were two people, my wife Elaine and our 5-year-old son, Michael. Michael was my whole life. Whenever I came home from work, he would run into my arms and refuse to let go. Then, one day, everything disappeared. Elaine had taken Michael to a nearby park. She looked away for only a few minutes. When she turned back, Michael was gone. We called the police. We searched the streets, hospitals, parks, and every place we could think of. But my son was nowhere. I refused to give up. Elaine couldn't. She spent years sitting by the front door, holding Michael's photograph against her chest. Every night, she whispered the same words, "He's coming home." But Michael never came back. Then, one morning, Elaine died. That was the day something inside me died too. I abandoned my home. I stopped caring about money, people, or even myself. I wandered through the streets until my mind slowly began to break. People called me crazy. Maybe they were right, but I never forgot one thing. Every evening, I still sat beside the road and searched the faces of strangers, hoping one of them would be my son. Then, on a cold, rainy evening, a black Mercedes stopped in front of me. A handsome young man stepped out. He looked wealthy, successful, and completely out of place beside a broken old man like me. He walked toward me and asked, "Sir, what are you doing out here alone?" I stared into his face. Something inside my chest suddenly tightened. I didn't know why, but for one impossible moment, I felt like I was looking at the little boy I had lost 40 years ago. My lips trembled. Then I whispered, "Michael, is that you?" The young man froze, and I had no idea that 40 years after my son's disappearance, the greatest secret of my life was standing right in front of me. I stared at the young man, waiting for him to say something. He finally shook his head. "My name is Alexander Reed," he said, "not Michael." I lowered my eyes. Maybe I had imagined it again. But Alexander didn't walk away. Instead, he looked at my soaked clothes and said, "Come with me. You can't stay out here in this weather." He took me to his home, a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of Chicago. He gave me clean clothes, food, and a warm room. I didn't understand why a wealthy young man would care about a broken old beggar like me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his face. There was something about him that felt strangely familiar. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my room. I opened the door and saw Alexander standing near an old wooden cabinet. He was looking through a collection of childhood belongings. Then he pulled out a small red toy. My heart stopped. I knew that toy. Michael had been holding a red toy just before he disappeared. I walked toward Alexander. "Where did you get that?" He turned around. "This?" he asked. "I've had it since I was a little boy." I stared at him. He continued, "I don't remember much about my childhood. I was told I was adopted when I was young." My hands began to shake. "Do you remember anything about your biological parents?" Alexander was silent for a moment. "I remember a woman crying while holding me, and a man telling me, 'Michael, don't be afraid.'" I couldn't breathe. I took the old photograph from my pocket, the same photograph I had carried for 40 years. I handed it to him. "Look at this." Alexander stared at the picture of my 5-year-old son. His expression changed. Then he slowly pulled down the collar of his shirt. There, just below his left shoulder, was a small scar, the same scar Michael had gotten as a child. My knees almost gave out. I reached for him. "You're my son." Alexander stepped back, overwhelmed. I don't understand." "You are Michael," I whispered. "I've been looking for you for 40 years. He stared at me with tears filling his eyes. But before either of us could say another word, Alexander told me something that made my heart sink again. "A few years ago, I received a letter." "What did it say?" He looked at me. It said my biological father was still alive. I felt my entire body go cold. After 40 years, I had finally found my son. But now I realized something even frightening. Michael hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had taken him from me, and whoever had done it had spent 40 years making sure the truth stayed hidden. I held Alexander's hand and asked, "Where is that letter?" He went upstairs and returned with an old, yellowed envelope. Inside was a short message. "Michael, your father is alive, but if you try to find him, you will put both of you in danger." There was no name at the bottom. I read those words again and again. Then, suddenly, a memory hit me. A blue car, a strange man, and Michael holding his little red toy. I remembered something else. A few weeks before Michael disappeared, my business partner, George Miller, had pressured me to give him control of my company. I refused. At the time, I thought his anger was nothing more than greed. Now I understood. George had a reason to destroy my life. Alexander and I searched through old police reports, adoption records, and newspaper archives. Finally, we found George's name. He had left Chicago shortly after Michael disappeared, but the truth was even more shocking. George hadn't killed Michael. He had arranged for someone to take him and leave him outside an orphanage. Then an affluent couple adopted him. That couple became the parents Alexander knew his whole life. George had threatened them, warning them never to tell Michael about his biological family. But Elaine had discovered part of the truth before she died. She had written a letter. Somehow, that letter eventually found its way to Alexander. I sat there in silence, realizing that I had spent 40 years believing my son was dead. All those years he had been alive, living under another name, only a few hours away from me. Alexander looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Dad, I'm sorry." I pulled him into my arms. "You didn't leave me, son. Someone took you from me." For the first time in 40 years, I held my son again. A few days later, Alexander took me to Elaine's grave. I stood there for a long time, holding his hand. Then I whispered, "Elaine, you were right. Michael came home." Alexander wiped away his tears. I looked at my son's face and finally understood something. I had spent 40 years sitting on sidewalks, waiting for the little boy to come back. But that little boy had never stopped existing. He had simply grown into the man standing beside me. And that was the greatest secret of my life. I wasn't really crazy. I was a father who had lost his son, lost his wife, and lost himself while waiting for the one person he loved most. But after 40 years, my waiting was finally over. My son had come home, and this time I knew he wasn't going anywhere.